At my son's high school graduation, my parents suddenly announced that they were taking his college fund and giving it to my nephew instead. I stood there shocked, trying to understand what they were saying. Then my husband started laughing and calmly said, "That's funny, because we moved that money last month." The smiles on their faces disappeared instantly. They began shouting when they realized what had really happened. The memory of that night at the steakhouse still feels like a jagged piece of glass pressed against my skin. We were there to celebrate my son Ethan's high school graduation, an evening that should have been defined by pride and the promise of a bright future. Instead, it became the moment my world shattered, the night I realized the people who raised me were capable of a cruelty I never saw coming. Watching the light die in my son's eyes as his own grandparents betrayed him is a sight that will haunt me until my dying day. Every sacrifice we made, every extra shift worked, and every late night Ethan spent hunched over his textbooks felt like it was being systematically dismantled by the two people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. The restaurant was one of those high-end establishments with white tablecloths and hushed conversations, a place we had carefully saved for because I wanted this milestone to feel significant. Ethan had earned it. He had pushed himself through grueling AP classes, balanced a demanding schedule of extracurriculars, and worked a part-time job, all while maintaining the grades that got him accepted into his dream university. My parents sat across from us, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe they were there to share in our joy. But as soon as the waiter set down our drinks, the atmosphere shifted. My mother picked up her silver fork and tapped it against the rim of her wine glass, the high-pitched ring cutting through the ambient noise of the dining room. She stood up with a self-satisfied grin that made my stomach turn before she even spoke. She cleared her throat, looking around the table with an expression of unearned authority. "Well, we have an announcement to make," she said, her voice dripping with a forced sweetness. "We have put a lot of thought into this, and we have decided that the money in Ethan's college fund will be going to his cousin Jason instead. He simply needs it more than Ethan does." The silence that followed was absolute. I felt my entire body go numb, the air leaving my lungs as if I'd been struck. Beside me, I saw Mark's knuckles turn white as he tightened his grip on his fork. Ethan's face, which had been glowing with excitement moments before, went deathly pale. My younger daughter looked back and forth between us, her eyes wide with a confusion she was too young to fully process. My father didn't look away, he just nodded in agreement, as if they were discussing the weather rather than stealing my son's future. "It is what is best for the family," he added firmly. "Jason has had a very rough time lately, and this will be the thing that finally helps him get his life back on track." Jason. My nephew. My brother's son. He was the golden child of the extended family, the one my parents had consistently favored while treating my own children like secondary characters in their lives. Jason was the kid they had bailed out of trouble more times than I could count, the one who lived a life of zero consequences because my parents were always there to catch him. I could feel the heat rising in my face, a slow-burning rage that had been simmering for years. Every time I had bitten my tongue when they dismissed my kids, every time I had swallowed my pride when they treated us like an afterthought compared to my brother, it all began to boil over in that moment. But Mark was faster than I was. He didn't explode. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply leaned back in his leather chair, took a slow, deliberate sip of his beer, and let out a low, amused chuckle. "That is actually very funny," Mark said, his eyes locking onto my mother's. "Because we moved that money last month." My mother's eyes blinked rapidly, her self-assured posture faltering for the first time. My father's smug smile wavered. "What?" my mother asked, her voice losing its sweetness and turning sharp and jagged. Mark leaned forward, a grim grin on his face. "Yeah," he said. "We saw this coming from a mile away. We knew exactly who you were, so we moved Ethan's college fund completely out of your reach weeks ago." The explosion was instantaneous. My mother's face turned a shade of crimson, so deep I honestly thought she might have a medical emergency right there at the table. "You had no right," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. Other diners began to turn and stare, but she didn't care. My father slammed his heavy hand onto the table, making the silverware rattle and a water glass tip over. "You cannot do that," he roared. "That money was meant for family." Finally, my voice returned, though it was shaking with the sheer force of my anger. "Ethan is family," I snapped, my voice cutting through their noise. "And that fund was his. You had absolutely no say in what happens to it. You were being incredibly selfish. My mom spat, her eyes narrowed into slits. Jason needs this. You know exactly how difficult things have been for your brother lately. We are trying to fix things for him, and you are purposefully ruining his chance at a better life. That was the moment the reality truly sank in. They had never intended for that money to be Ethan's. Not really. In their minds, it was just a stagnant pool of resources they were holding onto until the right person needed it. They were just waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in and redistribute my son's hard-earned future to cover for my brother's failures. I looked at Ethan. He was staring at his grandparents with a look of pure, unadulterated devastation. He had always known he wasn't the favorite, but this was a different level of rejection. This was proof that, in their eyes, he didn't even matter. Fixing things? I repeated, my voice trembling. You mean the way you fixed things the last time Jason stole from our house? Or the time he was arrested and you paid off the lawyers to make the charges disappear? Or maybe the time he totaled your brother's car and you just went out and bought him a brand new one? My father growled, his face contorted in a sneer. That is not the same thing at all. Jason has been struggling. Your brother is a single father doing his absolute best. And I am a mother doing my best. I shot back. And you just sat here, on one of the most important days of my son's life, and told him his future doesn't matter. You told him you were willing to steal the life he worked so hard for just to bail out a kid who has never worked for anything. My mother scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. Oh, please. Ethan is smart. He can just take out loans like everyone else does. That was the final straw. That was the exact second I knew there was no path back to being a family. Ethan stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. You know what? He said. His voice was trembling, but it was strong. I don't need a single thing from you. I don't need your money, and I definitely don't need people like you in my life. Mark stood up next, placing a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. Let's go, he said, his voice steady and calm, providing the anchor we all needed. We don't owe these people another second of our time. I stood up too, looking my parents in the eye for what I hoped would be the last time. This was your last chance, I told them. You have shown us over and over again who you truly are, but today you made sure we will never be able to forget it. We turned our backs and walked out of the restaurant. They screamed after us, their voices fading as we hit the cool night air. They called us ungrateful. They shouted that we were the ones tearing the family apart. But as I looked at my son walking toward the car, his head held high despite the visible pain in his eyes, I knew we had done the right thing. What I didn't know was just how far my parents were willing to go to get that money back. The fallout began almost immediately. At first, it was a barrage of phone calls, endless, furious voicemails from my mother screaming about betrayal and loyalty. My father left a few as well, his voice low and threatening, telling me I would live to regret my decisions. My brother, who had remained silent during the actual confrontation, finally sent a text 2 days later. I don't know what you think you're doing, but Jason needs that money more than Ethan. You're being incredibly selfish. There were no questions, no attempt to hear our side. Just the same old script. My children didn't matter, and I was the villain for protecting them. But then the situation escalated from family drama to something much more dangerous. A week after the dinner, Mark received a call from our bank. I was standing in the kitchen when I heard him say, "Excuse me? What withdrawal?" My heart dropped into my stomach. When he hung up, his face was a mask of cold fury. They tried to access the fund, he said. I gripped the edge of the counter to keep my hands from shaking. Who? My parents? He nodded. They called the bank pretending to be us. They claimed there was a family emergency, and they had our permission to make a massive withdrawal. My breath hitched. Did they get it? Mark shook his head. No. The bank flagged the request because something felt off, and they called me to verify. I wanted to scream at the sheer audacity of it. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my phone and dialed my father's number. The second he answered, I didn't give him a chance to speak. You actually tried to steal from us? I asked, my voice vibrating with rage. What is wrong with you? My father didn't even sound ashamed. You left us no choice, he said, his tone chillingly smooth. We wouldn't have had to resort to that if you weren't being so completely unreasonable. Unreasonable? I yelled. You tried to commit bank fraud. It's our money, my dad snapped back. We contributed to that fund. That stopped me cold. What? My mother's voice suddenly cut into the line, sharp and mocking. You think you did all of this on your own? You think we never put anything into that fund over the years? My hands clenched into fists. You never gave a single cent to Ethan's college fund. Not once. You're remembering it wrong, my father said. And if we were to take this to court, I guarantee a judge would agree that we have a legal right to those funds. My blood ran cold. Mark saw the look on my face and stepped closer. They wouldn't, he whispered, trying to reassure me. They don't have a leg to stand on. But I wasn't so sure. My parents were lifelong liars, bold, manipulative, and practiced. If they were willing to go this far, I had no idea what other nightmares they were planning to unleash on us. 3 days later, we got our answer. I was pulling into the driveway when I saw a thick, manila envelope sitting on the doorstep. The moment I saw the return address of a local law firm, a wave of nausea washed over me. I ran inside, my hands shaking so hard I could barely tear the paper open. Mark came into the living room, sensing the panic. They're suing us, I whispered, looking at the legal jargon on the page. Mark's head snapped up. What? They're claiming they co-funded the account, I said, my voice growing shrill as I scanned the documents. They're saying we illegally transferred the money without their consent and that they own a significant portion of the fund. Mark grabbed the papers from me, his eyes narrowing as he read. This is complete garbage, he muttered. But I knew better. My parents were experts at twisting reality until they looked like the victims. And as I looked at the legal summons, a terrifying thought took hold. In a world where they were willing to lie under oath, we might actually lose everything we had saved for our son. For the next few weeks, we were drowning in a sea of paperwork, suffocating under the weight of years of tax records, bank statements, and every financial scrap that could potentially clear our names. We were fortunate that our finances were clean and meticulously tracked, but that didn't make the process any less agonizing. The investigation was a slow, grinding machine, and while we knew we had done nothing wrong, the mere presence of the IRS in our lives felt like a dark cloud over our home. The worst part, however, was the collateral damage. The investigation didn't stay contained to us. It bled into Ethan's world. His college flagged his financial account due to the ongoing IRS review, putting a temporary but devastating hold on his scholarship disbursements. My parents hadn't just tried to steal his college fund. They were actively sabotaging his future, trying to derail the very life he had worked so hard to build. That was my absolute breaking point. If they wanted a war, I was ready to bring them hell. I began the first strike by digging through the past. I knew my parents had secrets. You don't grow up in a house built on manipulation and half-truths without learning where the bodies are buried. I had spent my childhood watching them bend the truth and twist stories to suit their needs, and if they were going to play dirty with my son's life, I was more than willing to meet them in the mud. It didn't take long to find exactly what I was looking for. My parents always projected an image of perfect responsibility, acting as if they were the moral and financial backbone of the entire family. But they had been sloppy. Years ago, Mark had helped them set up a small rental property investment, handling the initial paperwork and the early tax filings. In their arrogance, they had forgotten just how much access we had to their foundational records. As I combed through the old files, the pattern became clear. They had been significantly underreporting their rental income for over 15 years. They thought they were invincible, but their greed had left a paper trail that led straight to their door. I decided on a strategy of retaliation that started with a warning. I didn't report them to the authorities immediately. Instead, I wanted them to feel the same cold dread they had forced upon my family. I called my mother, and she picked up on the second ring, her voice dripping with that familiar, smug condescension. "Oh, so you're finally ready to apologize?" she asked, sounding as if she had already won. I almost laughed at the irony. "No," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a winter morning. "I'm calling to let you know that I found the real tax fraud in this family." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then she scoffed, though the bravado sounded thinner than before. "What on earth are you talking about?" "Your rental income," I replied. "You know, that extra money you conveniently forgot to report to the government for the last decade and a half?" I heard her breath hitch, a sharp intake of air that told me I had hit the mark. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she stammered. "Oh, I think I do," I said. "And more importantly, the IRS will have a very clear idea of what I'm talking about very soon." Unless, of course, you drop this ridiculous charade and call off the dogs immediately. The shift in her tone was instantaneous. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a desperate, hissed warning. You wouldn't. I smiled, though there was no joy in it. Try me. She hung up without another word, but the message had been received. 2 days later, we received a call from the IRS agent handling our audit. Suddenly, our case was no longer a priority. The anonymous tips had lost their weight, and the investigation was being closed due to lack of evidence. A week after that, the clouds began to lift for Ethan as well. His college funds were unfrozen, and his scholarship disbursements were restored. They had backed off for the moment, retreating into the shadows to lick their wounds. But I knew my parents. I knew their pride wouldn't allow them to let it end like this. They were cornered, and a cornered predator is at its most dangerous. I was right to be looking over my shoulder. The next escalation didn't come in a legal envelope or a phone call. It came in the dead of night. It was late, and the house was draped in the heavy silence of sleep. Mark and I were drifting in that deep, restorative slumber when the sound of glass shattering jolted us both awake. The noise was violent and unmistakable, echoing through the hallway and sending a surge of adrenaline through my veins. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sat up, my mind racing through every terrifying possibility. This wasn't a legal threat anymore. This was a direct, physical intrusion into the one place we were supposed to feel safe. For a split second, I thought I was still caught in the clutches of a nightmare. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable, heavy thud of footsteps moving inside our house. Mark was already out of bed, his face set in a grim mask of determination as he grabbed the baseball bat he kept tucked away for emergencies. He motioned for me to call 911, and my hands were shaking so violently I nearly fumbled the phone onto the floor. Just as I started to dial, a voice cried out from the hallway. Mom? Dad? Ethan. Panic surged through me like an electric shock. He was awake, and instead of staying safely behind his locked door, he was coming downstairs to investigate the noise. Stay in your room, Mark shouted, but it was too late. We stepped into the hallway just as Ethan reached the top of the stairs, and that's when we saw the intruder. It was Jason. He was standing in the middle of our living room, looking wild-eyed and desperate, swaying on his feet with the unmistakable stench of alcohol clinging to him. In his hand, he gripped a heavy crowbar. For a long, suffocating moment, no one moved. Then Jason took a shaky, stumbling step forward, his voice a slurred growl. Where is it? He demanded. Mark tightened his grip on the bat, his voice low and dangerous. Where is what, Jason? The money. Jason screamed, his voice cracking with a pathetic kind of grief. I deserve it. They promised it to me. In that moment, the sick truth clicked into place. My parents had sent him. They knew they couldn't touch the money legally after our threat, so they had weaponized their own grandson's desperation to do their dirty work. Jason staggered toward us, raising the crowbar. You think you can just take what's mine? He spat. Ethan took a step forward, his fists clenched tight. It was never yours, he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the fear. You need to leave. Right now. Jason let out a broken, bitter laugh. Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it? The answer came with a deafening crack. Mark didn't hit Jason, but he swung the bat into the wall beside him with such force the house seemed to shake. The sound was enough to snap Jason out of his drunken haze. He stumbled back, his eyes widening in sudden realization of the line he had crossed. Without another word, he turned and bolted out the front door. The police arrived 10 minutes later, and by the time the sun began to rise, Jason was in a cell, arrested for attempted burglary. My parents, true to form, bailed him out before breakfast. When my mother had the audacity to call me that morning, she didn't offer an apology. You've gone too far this time, she hissed. You had your own nephew arrested. I almost laughed at the sheer delusion. He broke into my home with a weapon, I told her. That's on him, and it's on you. She was quiet for a long moment before whispering a final, chilling threat. You will regret this. 2 weeks later, the war moved to a neutral battlefield. My brother called, sounding exhausted and broken, begging for a meeting to end the chaos. Against my better judgment, Mark and I agreed to meet at my parents' house. It felt like walking into a combat zone. My parents sat stiffly on their floral couch, my father refusing to even meet my gaze. When my brother walked in with a gaunt, hollow-looking Jason, the room felt like it was losing oxygen. "Let's just get this over with," my brother sighed. "Look, we all screwed up." Mark scoffed instantly. We? We didn't do anything but protect our son." My brother waved a hand dismissively. "I just mean this isn't what Mom and Dad wanted." I let out a bitter, jagged laugh. "They wanted to steal from my son," I said. "They wanted to use Jason to terrorize us in our own home. So please, tell me what exactly they didn't want." That was when Jason finally spoke, his voice hoarse and small. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he muttered. I thought the money was mine." My stomach turned. "You thought it was yours? Why?" Jason swallowed hard and looked at my mother. The guilt on her face was instantaneous. She turned away, unable to maintain the lie any longer. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "You told him, didn't you?" I whispered. "You told him the fund was already his, that it wasn't just being given to him, but that it belonged to him all along." "We had to." My mother snapped, finally exploding. "He was struggling. Your brother was struggling. We had to give him some hope." "So you lied to him," I said, my voice rising. "You fed him a fantasy and sent him on a crash course with a prison cell just to cover for your own failures." My father finally spoke, his voice sharp and unrepentant. "What does it matter? You and Mark have everything. Jason had nothing. What kind of sister are you to let your nephew suffer?" Something inside me finally snapped, the last thread of loyalty I had been clinging to. "What kind of parents are you?" I hissed, stepping toward them. "You've spent your entire lives treating me like a second-class citizen while you handed everything to my brother. And now you expect me to sacrifice my son's future to pay for your mistakes? No. You did what you always do. You chose him over me. But this time, you got caught." Jason was shaking his head, looking at my mother as if seeing a stranger. "You lied to me," he whispered. "You swore I wouldn't have to worry about college." He looked at me, a flicker of genuine regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, before turning and walking out of the house. We walked out too, ignoring my parents' frantic screams that we were the ones destroying the family. This time, when I said we were done, I meant it. My brother tried to reach out once, admitting he had been blinded by our parents' manipulation, but the bridge was already gone. Jason, surprisingly, used the incident as a way-up call. He stayed out of trouble and started taking classes at a community college on his own dime. As for Ethan, he went to the university he worked so hard for. My parents never saw a single cent of his money, and they never saw us again. Cutting off your parents feels like grieving the dead, but I've learned that it is far better to bury a painful past than to let it keep poisoning your future. We chose to live.